Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. In 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte delivered a coup de grace to the Holy Roman Empire at the Battle of Austerlitz, where the combined forces of Russia and Austria were decisively defeated by his smaller army. This victory established the French Empire as the dominant military power of the continent, pioneering new innovations in infantry tactics and artillery that left the rest of Europe in the dust. Napoleon swiftly reorganized the shattered remnants of the Holy Roman Empire into a French vassal and turned his attention to larger matters. In the end, it took the nations of Europe 23 years and 7 coalitions to bring revolutionary France down in 1815. However, within a generation, a second French empire was founded by Napoleon's nephew. But in contrast to his uncle's military success, Napoleon III's empire was dismantled in a little over 6 weeks against a revitalized...
I cannot stand Napoleon III. He comes off as a royal prick, at least in my opinion. He sees himself very much in the same light as his uncle, and he absolutely is not. In fact, he has gone, like, France is going the other direction. Prussia is the one that is kind of taking Europe by storm and pushing this militarism forward. It's not France. France is, well, you're about to see, France is about to get stomped out.
Confederation of German states who proceeded to bombard their way to the gates of Paris. It can be argued that the Prussian leadership carried the legacy of French military innovation seen in the Napoleonic Wars better than the French themselves in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871.
They absolutely did. I don't feel like that's really even an argument. Napoleon is known for being on this sort of cutting edge of tactics and military ideas. That is not France at this time period. That's Prussia at this time period. And it's because, just like when Napoleon was leading France, France had this brilliant military leader, right? Well, the Prussians have one now. They have a brilliant military leader, and he is going to push this. I don't know if I would call it French militarism. That might be a little too strong. So maybe he's saying that's what the argument is. But they are pushing the idea of kind of these new cutting edge military tactics and innovations forward. That is definitely Prussia.
The battle that would bring the Second Empire down was won primarily by skillful maneuvering and massed artillery, something Napoleon I was known for. This incompetence surely left Napoleon I's tail-coated corpse spinning in his grave, who once quoted, "God fights on the side with the best artillery." In this video, we'll see exactly how this conflict played out, and how the Germans were able to reverse their French rivals' fortunes so decisively. With the formation of the North German Confederation in 1867, Europe had a new power to contend with. The Austro-Prussian War the year prior saw a David and Goliath struggle between the Kingdom of Prussia and the Empire of Austria for control over the German-speaking states, which resulted in a clear victory for Prussia and the formation of the North German Confederation. Legendary Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck was chiefly responsible for this conflict, having carefully manipulated...
Yeah, this is all he wants. I mean, he is doing everything behind the scenes that he can to not just get the fight with Austria. He wants to fight with Denmark initially, then he wants to fight with Austria, then he wants to fight with France. He is manipulating everything to essentially facilitate these conflicts. And then he has somebody else in his corner who is actually going to lead the Prussian and then German military in these conflicts, and that is the elder von Moltke.
manipulated events to ensure that his modern, prosperous state took the lead in German affairs, instead of the ethnically divided and militarily outmoded Austria. But Prussia's sudden return to international prominence did not go unnoticed by its perennial adversary, France. Emperor Charles-Louis Napoleon III was constantly trying to emulate the deeds of his more famous uncle, and had even timed his coup against the former Republican government to coincide with the storied victory at Austerlitz. Seeing Prussia's rapid expansion as a threat to the balance of power in Europe, Napoleon III's cabinet ministers urged him to demand territorial concessions along the west bank of the Rhine to fortify France's eastern border. This was precisely what Bismarck wanted. A number of German states had yet to join the nascent North German Confederation, and Bismarck believed that a war with France would be necessary to coax them into the fold and complete the unification of Germany.
So the thought process here is they see Prussia and now this North German Confederation as maybe not like a historical enemy, but certainly not a historical friend, right? But what happens is the reason why Bismarck is pushing for this war with France, and he's going to brilliantly do it, is because all of the Germans see France as much more of an enemy than the rest of the Germans, right? And so that's what happens. He kind of finds a boogeyman. And then when the southern German states realize, oh, France is going to come take us. Like we are going to be, we're Germans and we're on the way to the North German Confederation. That's an issue. And so they flock to that German banner, which is exactly what Bismarck wants.
Bismarck rejected Napoleon III's demands out of hand, and the French emperor proved all too eager to walk straight into Bismarck's traps. In 1870, the manufactured threat of a Spanish-Prussian alliance was enough to spark a full-scale conflict between the two belligerent nations. The stage was set for a war that would redefine the political balance of Europe. The French and German militaries represented some of the best soldiers on the continent, both of which had recent victories, the former against Russia and Austria, and the latter against Austria and Denmark.
Austria's been having a rough go of it lately.
The French army was a professional organization that employed selective conscription for long service periods, with benefits offered to those choosing to re-enlist. Meanwhile, the German military was built upon the foundation of universal conscription for a much shorter service period. As was common at the time, both nations only kept a fraction of their men under arms during peace, relying on their trained reserves to quickly fill the ranks when war broke out. Under the French system, this allowed for a reserve of around 400,000 professional soldiers, while the Germans could call upon a veritable human ocean of over 1 million conscripts. The key, of course, was getting all of them armed and shipped to the front lines in an orderly fashion. From the outset, both sides knew that early action would prove decisive. Under pressure from his military planners to strike before the Germanic horde could assemble, Napoleon left Paris on the 28th of July, 1870, to command the Army of the Rhine, which marched east to invade Germany and liberate the southern states from Prussian oppression.
So okay, first off, that's kind of hilarious, the way that's framed. He is going to liberate them from Prussian oppression. They immediately declare for Prussia right when the war starts. So that's that's a funny thing that he kind of threw in there. But this probably is not a terrible idea. If you're going to go fight Prussia, this probably is not a terrible idea. Now, I have my issues with France deciding to pick a fight right now. They don't have the leadership. They're not really in a great place. And Prussia looks incredibly OP to the rest of Europe right this second. And so why you would want to go jump into a conflict with them, I have my issues with that. However, if Napoleon III is going to say, nope, we're going to war with Prussia, like it is what it is, then I think the best move is to try to mobilize quickly, because Prussia is going to overwhelm you if you wait. And so I think this is the best tactical decision. However, like I said earlier, Prussia has an ace in the sleeve, and that is Helmut von Moltke the Elder. And, you know, he's brilliant. He's brilliant as not as an on-field general moving troops around, but as a general field marshal with, you know, the entire army at his disposal. He is incredibly well suited for this type of stuff. And so he's going to get troops very quickly to the right place, and it's going to end up kind of blowing up in France's face. However, my point is, I don't think that this is a terrible decision. I think going to war as France is a terrible decision, but I think the early mobilization and push forward is not a terrible idea.
Of course, this again played directly into Bismarck's hands, as the southern states had declared themselves for Prussia the moment they had received word of French mobilization. But such details would be irrelevant if the North German Confederation failed to secure victory. The opening shots of the war were fired on the 2nd of August, when the French Second Corps, under the command of General Charles Froissart, crossed the border and attacked the town of Saarbrücken, which his scouts had informed him was defended only by a single, isolated regiment. Froissart had good reason to be confident, as his troops were armed with breech-loading, bolt-action chassepot rifles. The Germans, on the other hand, used the Dreisse needle rifle, a decades older and less effective model than the chassepot. In the skirmishes that followed, the French rifle proved itself a far superior weapon in most respects, especially in terms of accuracy at long range. The French also deployed the terrifying mitrailleuse, a multi-barreled volley gun capable of firing up to 125 high-caliber rounds a minute. Thanks to these advantages, the Second Corps easily captured the town despite stiff resistance. Emboldened by this early success, Napoleon III was eager to continue the offensive, only to be stunned by reports of a German army advancing south across the border towards the town of Wissembourg, which was defended by the 5,000 men of the French First Corps under General Abel Douay. Despite being horribly outnumbered, the First Corps fought bravely, using their complement of mitrailleuse guns to carve bloody swaths in the ranks of the attackers. But when German artillery fire killed General Douay, the terrified civilians threw open the gates and hoisted a white flag of surrender. But the French soldiers fought on, firing from rooftops onto the horde of German soldiers pouring into the town. This bloody house-to-house fighting continued until German artillery closed to point-blank range, threatening to annihilate the remaining defenders. Only then did the First Corps surrender. In response to this shocking turn of events, Napoleon hurriedly entrusted Marshal Patrice Macmon with command of his 3 southernmost army corps, and dispatched them to engage the Germans as they advanced deeper into French territory. But unbeknownst to Napoleon, this was only one of 3 German armies that had been assembled at the border since mid-July. This feat of military logistics was all thanks to Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke, widely regarded as the finest military mind of his generation. Since the early 1860s, German general staff officers had been traveling throughout France, surveying terrain, creating excellent maps, some of which rivaled French-made maps of their own country, and calculating the available food supplies of every fortress and town in the northeastern part of the country, allowing Moltke to rush his reserves to the border far faster than the French had ever anticipated. Ignorant of these facts, MacMahon's 45,000 men marched southeast, taking up defensive positions on a heavily wooded ridgeline near the town of Werth, which provided clear lines of fire across the open fields beyond. As the Germans marched forward, they were subjected to a withering barrage of the morale-crushing mitrailleuse guns, while chassepot rifles dealt most of the real damage, picking off stragglers at ranges that the needle rifle simply could not match.
And so what you see in the Franco-Prussian War are kind of the precursors to what you'll see in World War I itself, right? You'll see the way that the Prussians use artillery and the newer artillery, bigger artillery. That is kind of a precursor to what is going to be done in World War I. You see the mitrailleuse guns as the precursor to what will be the regular machine guns in World War I. And so that's kind of what this is a preamble, if you will, to the Great War.
But while the French held the line against the enemy infantry, they found themselves at the mercy of German artillery. To his horror, MacMahon realized that the supposedly invincible French artillery corps was completely outclassed by the new Krupp-designed cannon, which employed state-of-the-art fuses and breech-loading mechanisms to fire faster and more accurately than the French muzzleloaders. In the face of incessant barrages, the French were forced to flee the field, having suffered nearly 20,000 casualties in a matter of hours. Further west, things had been going just as badly for the French Second Corps. On the same day, MacMahon engaged the Prussian Third Army near Werth. General Froissart was in a pitched battle with the 1st and 2nd Prussian armies near Spicheren. Soon after the action commenced, Froissart noticed that his positions were being quickly surrounded and overwhelmed. This was a result of German infantry tactics, which favored independent platoons attacking from multiple directions. The French hoped to counter this with tight defensive formations and massed firepower, but these were vulnerable to being encircled by the much better coordinated German units. Although he recognized this issue, all of Froissart's efforts to coordinate his troops and request reinforcements were frustrated by poor lines of communication, and by evening he was forced to order a withdrawal to the south. When the news of these twin disasters reached his ears, a shell-shocked Napoleon III ordered the Army of the Rhine into an unceremonious retreat to Metz, abandoning most of eastern France to German occupation. With his dreams of glory shattered, the distraught emperor begrudgingly yielded command of his remaining forces to Marshal François-Achille Bazaine, who promptly began bickering with the rest of the general staff over what to do next. This resulted in the French taking over a week to cross the river Moselle, giving the Germans numerous opportunities to delay them further. In fact, the French retreated even slower than the Germans had calculated. And when 30,000 men of the Prussian Second Army were sent to harass the French rearguard near the village of Maz-la-Tour, they instead found themselves confronted by an entire...
Who is that down at the bottom? Is that the Bavarians? William of Prussia. Bavarian Corps. Yeah, okay. So that's the white and blue are Bavarians.
Enemy army. This unexpected turn of events should have resulted in a decisive victory for Bazaine, and the brave marshal demonstrated his valor by throwing himself into the center of the action. Unfortunately, this isolated him from the chain of command, leaving the other French officers involved in the battle to act on their own initiative, something they were completely unprepared for. Sensing chaos among the enemy ranks, the outnumbered Germans took the offensive, culminating in a reckless charge by 2 heavy cavalry regiments against the French artillery positions. This act of suicidal bravery, later dubbed the Death Ride, cost half of the 800 horsemen their lives, but successfully silenced the French guns.
Bismarck's son is wounded in that charge.
Left unsupported, the French infantry were unable to break the thin German lines, which held despite being outnumbered almost 4-1. By the late afternoon, German reinforcements began to flow into the area, and Bazaine was forced with the horrible revelation that his men were simply too exhausted to continue trying to break out to the west. Left with no choice, he ordered a retreat back to Metz, hoping to at least rest and resupply. After the near disaster at Mas-la-Tour, Moltke opted for caution. While the Third Army continued its pursuit of Macmont in the south, Moltke ordered the Second Army to advance toward the French positions on the Moselle and the village of Gravelotte. The two forces engaged shortly before noon on August 18th, with the French choosing to dig in and hold fast to their defensive lines. As in previous battles, many German attacks stalled in the face of superior French firepower, but Prussia dominated the artillery duel, with over 200 cannon laying waste to enemy positions and causing a mass rout at the village of Saint-Privat. Seeing disaster looming, French General Charles Bourbaki led the famed Imperial Guard to reinforce the line. But upon seeing his allies already fleeing, Bourbaki halted the advance, reportedly protesting, "You promised me victory, now you get me involved in a rout." When the rest of the French saw the Imperial Guard preparing to withdraw, their morale collapsed, and the entire army retreated in disarray behind the fortifications of Metz, where it was promptly encircled and besieged. Despite suffering over 20,000 casualties compared to the French count of 12,000, the Battle of Gravelotte was a decisive victory for the Germans. The very next day, Moltke began enacting the next stage of his plan. German losses had been heavy, and General Steinmetz of the Prussian First Army had failed to trap the French Second Corps at Spicheren. So, with the stroke of a pen, Moltke replaced him. Such a casual dismissal of a high-ranking officer would have been unthinkable in the French army, which had been suffering a critical shortage of competent officers and was often crippled by favoritism and petty rivalries. Meanwhile, what was left of the Second Army was reconstituted into a new Fourth Army, which was sent marching west to link up with the Third Army and attack Marshal Macmont, who was rallying his forces at Chalons. By this point, it had become clear to everyone in the French army that Napoleon III was gravely ill. The 61-year-old emperor had long suffered from numerous health conditions, but these had been kept a state secret. But now his troops could watch him hobbling about the camp in constant agony from a combination of advanced arthritis and gallstones. In a way, his condition mirrored the state of the French army, whose own weaknesses had been so starkly revealed in the recent battles. The selective conscription system had allowed any man with money to buy his way out of service, leaving nothing but the poorest, illiterate dregs to fill the ranks. The few career soldiers remaining were either too old to be effective or had fallen victim to the rampant alcoholism that had plagued the military for years. But although he was completely outnumbered, Macmont had to act. It was imperative Metz be relieved, no matter the cost. Thus, he drove his 120,000 exhausted, feckless soldiers into march on August 21st to the aid of Bazaine, doing his best to march along a course that would avoid contact with the Prussian armies. But Macmont's efforts were doomed, and he was unable to do anything to prevent his force from being quickly spotted and shadowed by German cavalry patrols, which reported their location straight back to Moltke. Upon learning of this threat, Moltke simply ordered the 3rd and 4th armies to catch the much smaller French force in a pincer move. When he realized he was being pursued, Macmont deployed his men in a defensive triangle near the obsolete 17th century fortress of Sedan, with the river and fortifications at his back. Summing up the situation, one of his subordinates famously remarked, "We are in a chamber pot, about to be on." Interestingly, the first ever photograph of active combat in history was taken during this battle, as a photographer stood on a grassy hill overlooking the countryside with the French defenders. On September 1st, the Battle of Sedan began. The first shots were fired in the outlying village of Bazaine, where Bavarian troops encountered a motley collection of French soldiers, a contingent of Marines diverted from the Baltic, and armed civilians, all firing at them from rooftops, doorways, trees, and church steeples. Caught by surprise, the Bavarians were forced to commit to brutal house-to-house fighting that continued well into the afternoon. But while the outnumbered defenders of Béziers continued to hold out, the rest of the Prussian army continued to methodically encircle Sedan, pushing the French back from their defensive positions and destroying any isolated units with concentrated artillery fire. Marshal MacMahon continued trying to rally his men and stage a breakout at La Moselle, but he was abruptly wounded in the fighting and had to withdraw from the battlefield. This led to a dispute in the chain of command, as when MacMahon's designated successor ordered a retreat, he was overruled by another general who had only just arrived from Paris under orders from the French Minister of War. With no way to establish a clear chain of command, the army dithered, losing all sense of direction. By the late afternoon, the village of Béziers was finally taken by the Bavarians, who sustained nearly 4,000 casualties in the battle. With their southern positions now completely overrun, and the Prussian army crossing the river Moselle to the west, the French were slowly hemmed in on all sides and forced to retreat behind the walls of Sedan. But the French were not even afforded the dignity of a glorious last stand, as instead of assaulting the walls, the Germans instead lined up over 400 guns on the heights outside the town and commenced a devastating bombardment. As the day wore on, Emperor Napoleon III began riding aimlessly back and forth among his troops, despondently hoping that a German shell would end his misery. Meanwhile, the French cavalry desperately tried to break out through enemy lines, but their charges were all repelled. Each time, despite suffering heavy losses, the cavalry reformed and charged again, prompting King Wilhelm to exclaim, "Ah, those brave men." At around 5 p.m., Napoleon finally realized that God had no intention of letting him commit suicide by artillery shell and raised a white flag over the citadel. By
That bullseye on his horse is hilarious.
this late hour, the French army had been all but annihilated as a fighting force, having lost all cohesion thanks to the merciless shelling that made any kind of counterattack or breakout an impossibility. Upon seeing that their thoroughly beaten enemy was finally surrendering, a Prussian representative was detached to meet with the emperor, and then returned to King Wilhelm bearing a message. "Having been unable to die in the midst of my troops, there remains nothing for me but to deliver my sword into your majesty's hands. I am your majesty's true brother, Napoleon." As a heavy rainfall began, what remained of the French army marched out of their shattered fortress into captivity. Of the 124,000 that had begun the battle, 17,000 had been killed or wounded. A further 21,000 had been taken prisoner during the fighting, leaving only 83,000 to surrender along with their emperor. A mere 3,000 had escaped to the north, fleeing to Belgium, where they were promptly detained and disarmed. Rarely in French history had a defeat been so utter and complete, much less one fought on their home soil. The defeat of MacMahon and the capture of the emperor, and the loss of his entire army in the span of a single day, was the death sentence for the Second French Empire. At this point, Napoleon III was deeply unpopular with many of his subjects.
How could he not be? He takes the throne, gets into a war, gets his teeth stomped in, and basically the French don't have another standing army. I mean, it's over. The Prussians have not only beaten you, they have completely humiliated you. I'm not surprised the support has dwindled.
And the moment word of his capture reached Paris, an angry mob rose up and overthrew his government, declaring the beginning of the Third Republic. But despite the head of the new government, General Louis Trochu, boldly proclaiming that he would cede not an inch of our soil or a stone of our fortress, the reality was that France no longer had a strong enough army in the field. It was no longer a matter of if France would cede soil and stone, but how much. Yet as they marched toward the capital, the German armies found themselves being constantly harassed by French partisans. These were the Francs-Tireurs, or Free Shooters, a militia force made up primarily from members of the pre-war French shooting clubs. In the end, their valiant efforts delayed the German advance long enough for an army of more than 400,000 men to assemble for the defense of Paris. Sadly, the majority were members of the Paris National Guard, which was barely more than a ragtag group of angry political dissidents. Only around 60,000 were actual soldiers, with another 100,000 being part of the Garde Mobile, which consisted of men who had paid their way out of conscription into the regular army. When the Germans reached Paris on the 17th of September, they effortlessly turned back a poorly organized sortie by the defenders and had the city completely encircled within 24 hours.
Yeah, this is over. I mean, it's over. There's going to be an argument on whether or not they're going to shell the city. Von Moltke does not like that idea. He finds it against the rules of war, you could say. But as far as French resistance, I mean, it's over.
During this initial conflict, the imperial palace at Versailles was captured, becoming the headquarters of the besieging army. All the way back at Metz, Marshal Bazaine and his men had been incredibly busy, starving to death. The German siege lines were unbreakable, and on October 27th, Bazaine finally surrendered his entire force of 133,000 into captivity. The only real French victory of the war occurred on November 9th, when 70,000 troops from the newly raised Army of Loire routed 20,000 Bavarians and liberated the city of Orléans. This inspired the defenders of Paris to keep fighting despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them, and even a days-long bombardment by German field artillery failed to break their spirits. But even as the citizen army continued to hold out, King Wilhelm I staged a grand coronation at the captured Palace of Versailles on January 18th. This was the culmination of his and Bismarck's imperial ambitions, and had been directly enabled by the very French invasion that had scared the southern German states into joining the Confederation. A week later, Bismarck demanded that the bombardment of Paris be intensified, and despite Moltke's objections, the new Kaiser granted his request. A battery of powerful Krupp siege guns was set up outside the city, and under Bismarck's direction, they began systematically reducing the French capital to a smoking pile of rubble. Faced with a choice between capitulation or annihilation, the provisional government chose the former, and the city finally surrendered on January 27th. At midnight, after agreeing terms with Bismarck, an armistice came into effect, which included provisions for an immediate ceasefire and the disarmament of all but a single French division. After just 6 months, the war was over. Despite being victorious in almost every single major engagement, the Germans had suffered substantial losses, totaling around 28,000 dead and 88,000 wounded. But French casualties had been far greater, over 150,000 dead, with at least the same number of wounded.
Well, and the French got their teeth kicked in, the Germans got an empire. So when you look at the math on lives lost and casualties and everything like that, I mean, the end equation is France basically falls. Their empire falls. And you have the Republic, obviously, come into effect. And then the Germans get their new German Empire, which is going to play such a big role in upcoming events.
And an astounding 723,000 captured. The civilian population was also devastated, with numerous towns and villages burnt to the ground in reprisal for partisan attacks, and tens of thousands killed during various sieges. But the bloodshed didn't end there. On March 18th, a communist uprising seized control of the capital and declared the Paris Commune independent of the Third Republic. After hastily rebuilding their forces, with Bismarck's permission of course, the Republicans stormed the city and destroyed the Commune in what became known as the Bloody Week, between May the 21st and the 28th. Meanwhile, the Germans were busy celebrating the formation of their powerful, prosperous new empire. Kaiser Wilhelm would go on to see his nation expand to the status of a world power, complete with extensive colonial holdings overseas. His counterpart, the unfortunate Napoleon III, would go into exile and never return to France. He died 3 years after the war, living just long enough to see the Republic place all of the blame for France's defeat squarely on his shoulders. On his deathbed, the disgraced emperor reportedly whispered the words, "Isn't it true that we weren't cowards at Sedan?"
Okay, so that was how Prussia ended the French Empire, the Franco-Prussian War by the Armchair Historian. That was a good video. I really liked it. Like I said, I've got a playlist of Franco-Prussian War stuff that I want to get to soon, so I wanted to do kind of a general overview of it. I know everything looks different. Even my camera down in the bottom of the screen looks different. I'm playing with some different masks because whenever I took the mask off, because, you know, before I had the circle mask on there, when I took it off, it made me have to like squish everything together to make it fit down there. So I'm playing with some different stuff to see what I like and what I don't like. So again, just try to be patient with me. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I will put the link to the Discord in the description box down below. And I'll see you all next time.